afternoon, everybody. It took me several years travelling around Australia, 5 states, researching richland, wasteland. But from that and from the visits to more than 100 communities on invitation to speak about the book in the years after that, and then from my continuing involvement ever since, I know that pursuing a coal seam gas or any other unconventional gas industry is as dumb, dangerous and disrespectful to people, to our land, our water and our future as keeping us tied to coal. I'm going to talk about that in general, and in particular though about the current AGL fracking fiasco that Holly has told you some about. It's just 2 hours from where I've moved to, from the Hunter, just downstream of Gloucester in the Manning Valley near Taree. But most of New South Wales has exploration licences over it for some resource or another. There's actually 19 million hectares in New South Wales for CSG alone. So nowhere can be guaranteed safe until we change those mining laws, because they still trump all other laws and rights. For me, the critical issue in relocating as to where from the coal trash tundra wasn't whether a project might be under exploration there, but whether a project would be allowed to go ahead. And I mean by that, allowed by the people, not by the planning department, because under both major parties we know that the planning department is not the independent arbiter it's supposed to be. They're on the side of the proponents. The grand plan for New South Wales is clearly not to protect the people's land and water for future generations, no matter what sham strategic plans are drawn up, no matter what gateless gateways they introduced, and however many stringent paper conditions are placed on their approvals. Because the possibility of no impact or no project is never on the table. In my new valley, almost every gate on those rural roads had a lock the gate, no trespass sign on it, with the logo of the Manning Clean Water Action Group, of whom I'm now the patron. So I knew that local awareness had been raised and that any resistance would be very strong should Pangaea Resources attempt to take up their exploration licence there. And that would not have been the case 5 years ago. It was 2010 when I first started travelling around and investigating this matter. Back then, companies could still take advantage of people's ignorance and of the natural rural tendency to trust what you're told. Nowadays, it would be a really bad business move for any company to take on an alerted area where the locals would be vigilant, they'd be documenting and photographing any breaches or accidents and doing the EPA's job actually. And they might even take it to the extremes of holding protests and blockades. And that creates very bad PR, frightens the shareholders and the potential investors, brings down the share prices and hurts the profit line. And as we know, that has happened with Magasco in the Northern Rivers and with Santos in the Pilliga. Surprisingly, it hasn't happened with AGL yet. This local resistance, however, would not be composed of outside professional activists, as the industry would have us believe, extremists like the Knitting Nanas Against Gas out to destroy our society. And it wouldn't be motivated just because it's become politically correct to be anti-CSG in many circles, but because we now know, not only from the appalling, escalating results in the US after 20 years, and we keep being told, oh, they've been doing it in America for years. Well, they have, and that's what we're looking at. But also, unfortunately now from Queensland and New South Wales, CSG extraction cannot be done without serious and often irreversible impacts on water and health, except on paper, of course. To fight CSG in your area is a fight for survival, a fight against industrialisation, community division, the pollution of air, water, ground and noise pollution as well, and all the attendant health problems that come from that. It's a fight against diminished water supplies and the dangers of explosions. It's a community in Pennsylvania, Bradford, where they have monitors, gas monitors outside every house after 2 homes exploded from the fugitive emissions. However, APPEA that is the industry body, the association, assured us that the CSG industry is one of the most heavily regulated and scrutinised in the country. To me, these statements mean, God help us if this is the best we've got or aspire to. When I began my coal travels in early 2010, I hadn't heard much about CSG except a bit at Brogue and Gloucester, and I felt I had more than enough to cover nationally with coal. But in Queensland, I realised that CSG is as damaging, if less obvious, than a huge hole in the ground. Gas from coal is merely a different invading army in the same war. Same government backing, same disenfranchised victims. Now, like many of you probably first woke up when you saw the Gasland film, and many of you were most shocked by being able to lightly tap water with methane. What actually struck me the most was the similarity in the tactics and the lies between what I was seeing on that film and what I'd found with the coal industry here. So apart from the lighting the taps, it was the seriously ill and seriously denied and deceived residents, the legacy of toxic wells and streams, and the blithe dismissals by authorities of any connection between these problems and the mining. So, not surprisingly, the biggest chapter in the book turned out to be the March of Methane. Now, I'm learning to do tech stuff, which should have been on there the entire time, I now realise. This is my inspiration, and in any audience there's always a lot of people of my age or more. Many areas, however, unfortunately, are under threat from coal and coal seam gas, such as the Bylong Valley, next to the Hunter, that I chose to be the rich land for my title. Sadly, it's now nearly all bought out. The same happens, though, also in Southern Highlands, Gloucester, the Liverpool Plains, Queensland's Darling Downs, WA's Margaret River, and Gippsland's dairy regions. That coal and gas are even being considered in such sustainable rich lands shows the extent of this short-sighted insanity in many hitherto unthinkable areas. And the chapter in my book that I called Allowing the Unthinkable focuses totally on Gloucester and Margaret River. Putting these industries back on a par with any other business is what we have to demand to change the laws. These days they're mainly for export and they're mainly foreign owned, as about 85% of Australia's coal mines are foreign owned. In my opinion, no new thermal coal mine should be our national policy. If we had leaders who weren't so short-sighted and cowardly, so blinkered by the fossil fuel industry that they dare not envisage the carbon-free future to which smart nations like Germany are so rapidly heading. The states could show the way, but they get the royalties. We've been told by bodies like the World Bank that we must leave the majority of the fossil fuel reserves of the world in the ground to even begin to rein in global warming. Yet both our major parties, state and federal, ignore that and insist that it's our duty to keep exporting coal to help the poor people, the millions of poor people in India. They never talk about the clean and safe alternatives, putting one solar panel on every hut in India, for example. How do the major party politicians face their children when they insist on keeping our economy riding on the back of fueling global warming? I don't know. And here I'm going to make a political kind of statement, if you like, because I want to applaud the New South Wales Greens for coming out for this election and actually stating as a policy that the phasing out of thermal coal mines and thermal coal exports. I think that's very brave. And I've started to shout at the television. The next time I hear a politician dare to talk about coexistence of coal or gas in agricultural areas. Agriculture needs water, and coal and gas both waste water and wreck water. Lately it's been with the Chinese Shenhua mine on the Liverpool Plains, just approved, and the really shonky and really destructive Whitehaven Moores Creek mine, approved under state and federal Labor, by the way, but recently opened by Premier Baird. It is madness to threaten aquifers and mine or drill fertile, well-watered land. They are precious, long-term national treasures for the sake of short-term private profit from a product with reducing demand and increasing public disapprobation. In fact, Heather Ridout from the RBA board is coughing flack at the moment for a very mild version of that comment on Q&A last week. My favourite bumper sticker, my car's covered in them, not on the bumper actually, on the windows, but it says, "Coal costs the earth. So does the supposed interim saviour, methane gas. The industry calls it a cleaner energy source than coal, but we now know that when you include the whole life cycle, the leaks, the fugitive emissions, and the processing, and the fact that methane warms the atmosphere up to 70 times faster than CO2, its immediate impact is worse in these decades when we most need to slow global warming. It doesn't last as long, but we don't have long. In New South Wales, investment in CSG, coal's insidious offsider, will lock us in for decades, delaying the urgent move to renewable, zero emissions energy. We should ban it now and let's get on with the job." In Sydney, the public and medical groups' concerns and the media that got about health impacts caused Mr O'Farrell to knee-jerk and throw that 2-kilometre exclusion zone before. Yet it wasn't applied to the overly hastily approved Gloucester project. So are the people in Gloucester immune to those health impacts, or are they just unimportant? In Tara, as we now know, the effects of the health impacts have already been shockingly evident. You saw a little bit of it in the trailer. The children with rashes all over their body from the bore water, what's in the bore water, with headaches, nausea and bleeding from nose and ears. From what's in the air, from the flaring, the fugitive emissions, nobody's going to find out. Families are suffering and being ignored. Their lives are in ruins. Dr. Geraldine McCarran's report notes her particular concern about the apparent neurotoxic effects on the children there. Of course, as EcoFella told us, the industry's solution is to deny or disparage any adverse results. Yes, to lie. As they did with Southern Cross Uni's researchers' studies over Tara, when they found that the air there had more than 3 times the level of methane than in any non-gas field area. And we know there have been plenty of accidents in Queensland and now New South Wales, for us to know that any risks that are touted are more probable than possible. We've had many wells and fittings leaking, creeks bubbling, ground oozing with highly flammable methane. We've had, like as happened with the Nepean in the last big floods, or we had CSG pipes bursting in floods near Bundaberg, or uninjected carcinogenic chemicals turning up in quite a few places in Queensland. We've had the odd blowout, for example, as at Camden and Dalby, or escaped gas, as at Camden. I'm told they've now decided it's 10,000 cubic feet that got out, not 100,000. We've had bore levels dropping from depressurisation, a huge issue in Queensland for the graziers in those gas field areas. CSG water spills and dumps, killing everything they touch, as at the Pilliga. Years later, I've been there, and despite rehab attempts, everything's still dead there. As for our increasingly precious water, we have it on record, and I love quoting the industry, always. In August 2011, the industry as a whole, quote, conceded that extraction will inevitably contaminate aquifers and that good management could minimise the risks of water contamination but never eliminate them. Well, I think we're being shown by AGL what good management looks like. Aquifers can't be fixed. It is so simple. The word that kept occurring to me in all of the research of this book was insane. This is insane. The choice is really simple, water or CSG. And here is one occasion when I quote the late Bryce Courtney. It's not about being a greenie, it's about not being stupid. As Jess pointed out, the water produced from CSG extraction is contaminated from the coal, even without correcting chemicals, and it varies in salinity. Storing this in ponds or trucking it long distance for treatment while awaiting a solution to the problem, meanwhile adding to the problem, is simply crazy. Desalination will not treat the hydrocarbons and radioactive elements. How to deal with with CSG waste products is the most enormous elephant in the room, just like nuclear waste. Now to Gloucester. Groundswell Gloucester was formed a couple of years ago. They've been incredibly active behind the scenes, researching, investigating, digging up what's proven to be readily available dirt on AGL and lobbying. They've had locals regularly rostered on for an information shopfront and a roadside information vigil site, for example. In January 2014, that group presented Minister Roberts, oh no, it wasn't Minister Roberts then, sorry, but the government, with this 79-page document. It's called Exposing the Risks, Fundamental Flaws in AGL's Application to Frack CSG Wells in Gloucester. Very well documented, backed up by all sorts of experts. They warned them what would happen. It was ignored, and approval to frack those first 4 wells at the Walk Ivory pilot project was given. From the very first of that fracking, every morning there were very small groups of locals and a rolling band of supporters coming along too, usually outnumbered by the police, just sitting quietly opposite the gate on Fairburns Road as the Halliburton frackers were ushered in by the police, past the deadpan security guards. People who have to live just up the road had to watch helplessly, but not quietly, as the frackers' convoy entered in minibus and cars every day. Passions ran high, and the police had to protect what AGL was doing because it was legal, so we had to change the laws. Now, the whole of this rural road has been declared, or was declared, a no-stopping zone to make the protests even harder. So old people had a lot of trouble walking back up the hill after that vigil. Now, Groundswell Gloucester had applied to and eventually won permission from Council for a temporary protectors camp on Farmer Ed Robinson's land. It wasn't next to the fracking site, you had to be conveyed there by car, so it wasn't the most convenient, but the numbers built too slowly. This wasn't the Northern Rivers, and this never got to be a Bentley. It was only on the weekends usually, when lots of people came to attend the walks through Gloucester town, that we had the numbers to be able to do any serious action. Meanwhile, behind those high screens around each of the 4 frack sites, the fracking proceeded. And it had finished by the weekend that enough people, around 300, came to walk down Fairburns Road to allow 100 in the middle of that, well out of sight of the police following escort, to just peel off and walk onto the field and walk around the fence of the frack site to reclaim the land, symbolically at least. After attending a protest at AGL's AGM in Sydney, I decided to maximise what media credibility still lingered from my book and offered to step up my support. And I'm truly the most law-abiding person you would ever meet. I seriously cannot cross the road against the don't walk sign. However, next morning, under the eye of the security cameras, I did log on to an AGL gate. The police soon arrived, asking me at intervals during the morning to cease and desist, and eventually gave me a court notice for willful obstruction and left me there to fry. I did lots of media interviews, which was the point of it, from behind the necklock, and after about 5 hot hours, my local companions decided I should be freed. Nobody had actually tried to use that gate while I was there, so I pleaded not guilty, and after several court appearances and postponements, thanks to being represented by the EDO, the wonderful and much under-resourced EDO, please donate. The police have now, just a few weeks ago, announced they dropped the charge. So, about 20 arrests were made at Gloucester, compared to, say, I think it's nearly up to 300 at the Laird Forest. The judge at Gloucester Court, a lady, when I was there, clearly understood why all of these very respectable citizens were standing in front of her. And there were no convictions, just warning for those people that day. And the judge said, what AGL is doing in there is, and this is what she did, legal. Doesn't make it right. Very quickly after that fracking, though, came the proof of our world-class regulation and AGL's good management. During the fracking itself, it was discovered that they were using a radioactive element, cesium-137, to measure the density of the fracking fluid. It isn't really an issue, except that it wasn't mentioned in the approval process. trust us, we're a gas company. Is that good enough? No, I don't think so. Secondly, they've never said how the fracking, they've been asked and never said how they would deal with the toxic fracking wastewater, yet the fracking had still been approved. Now, as Holly said, we did find out in the end, and I'm sure that Hawkesbury is very happy about that. Then the next thing was that 2 fracking chemicals for which their licence requires 0 presence, and there's only 2 that's been, but 2 of those have been listed because they're considered to be indicator chemicals. If they've migrated, if they've appeared, then other chemicals are going to be there. Now the thing is that AGL knew that that 0 limit was exceeded in November, yet they kept fracking. And they didn't tell the EPA until January the 15th, when it was all over. Professor Philip Pells has said all along that at Gloucester there's a high risk of an environmental disaster. He considered it likely that fracking would connect the coal seam's polluted water with the beneficial shallow aquifers. Adaptive management, that's what it's called, that AGL was allowed to use. It really just means suck it and see, which always meant it would be too late to do anything after the disaster occurred, as it has. Next thing we found, and it's been a wonderful rolling series of AGL shooting themselves in both feet, then they had to admit large fluctuations of groundwater levels at the monitoring bores. They don't admit yet that fracking's the fault, but levels rose at one bore as much as 7.8 metres during the fracking and went down 3.5 metres after. Next, as Holly said, they admit there were BTEX chemicals there. Now, it's a bit of a misleading thing, because BTEX is just an acronym for 4 different chemicals, and they aren't telling us which ones they have actually found there. One of them, benzene, is a known carcinogen, and it's toxic at the rate of 1 part per billion. So only a tiny bit needs to get out. And yes, any of them can occur naturally, but usually it's the fracking activity that has released them and caused the pathways for them to migrate into the groundwater. Now, AGL discovered those chemicals, and they won't tell us which, so either they didn't test for them all beforehand, or they're just not going to tell us. They discovered them on January 15, but only reported them 2 weeks later. So after that avalanche of bad PR, they suspended the project themselves, and then the government, of course, did so too. So we had just about 2 months of world-class management of 4 wells. How are they going to manage 110 wells, or the 330 they want in the end? But don't worry, there's going to be a robust investigation. And Minister Roberts has appointed Ms Lee Shearer to oversee it. Now, Groundswell Gloucester does not question her abilities, but her past role as a consultant to the mining industry does give some, and one of her specialities was managing crisis situations. So it raises a few concerns about her total independence. The Nationals candidate in that area, Stephen Bromhead, because George Soros is stepping down, has been telling mainly the knitting nanas who've been following him, if it is found, and I'm quoting him, if it is found that AGL cannot demonstrate that they can prevent BTEX escaping from the coal seam, their licence for the Gloucester Basin will be cancelled and no new applications will be approved. It is so sad that nobody believes that there will not be wriggle room found post-election if they get in. Maybe AGL will just promise that they can capture it at the wellhead or something and it'll all be okay. But after O'Farrell's no ifs, no buts, nobody believes it. Yesterday I was in Gloucester to join them on the first of the 2015 walks. We had about 100 there. Next Tuesday I'm going back because Groundswell Gloucester is going to present a 600-page document, not exposing the risks anymore, exposing the truth. How AGL has failed to consult, report donations and has misled the community. They do incredible work behind the scenes and therefore they are not a fit and proper holder of the licence. They gave this to Minister Roberts on the 5th of February and asked him to suspend that licence. Now, something that I don't know if many of you saw this, but last week AGL admitted, and I've been quoting BP saying this years ago, there's enough LPG, liquid petroleum gas, in the Bass Strait reserves to avoid gas shortages in New South Wales. There goes the doomsday scenario justification for rushing to open up more risky unconventional gas fields for LNG. We don't need to poison or dewater Gloucester and the Manning or the Pilliga and the Great Artesian Basin or anywhere. Somehow, in reality, our values as a society have been turned into solely economic ones. This New South Wales government has shamefully enshrined into law that the significance of the resource must be given priority above water, environment and health. In effect, that profit be placed before people and planet. We have to stop such a slide. Now, I took one form of people power, but we all have the most potent of people powers in your votes. You can double that power. Your vote is never wasted on an independent or a minor party, and not everybody gets this, but if your candidate doesn't get in, you will like your preferences, the vote flows on and full value. In this pre-election time, in Stopping CSG matters to you, tell your concerns to your candidates, write to the local papers, talk to your friends, your neighbours, join your local no CS group. All our voices need to be raised, to be heard louder than the fossil fuel industries, to truly reinstate the triple bottom line, not just on paper, and to bring in the government our state needs with the courage to take us to a clean, green, safe and renewable future before it's too late. Thank you.